At the time of recording, I have been on God's beige earth for nearly 4 decades. I've heard it said that middle age officially starts at 40, but in all fairness, I feel like I've been here for a while now. While I suspect the COVID pandemic helped accelerate that feeling for a lot of people, for me, it was the prior experience of getting married, embarking on what was, at least on paper, a professional career, and subsequently ceasing to perform music publicly, even as a hobby, all while still in my early 30s, that I began to accept that in my heart of hearts, that I was, outwardly at least, no longer young, even if internally I'm basically still a simple-minded, feckless teenager and always will be. I realise now that almost all adults are exactly that. Tellingly, I'm now at the point where I've quite happily lost any desire to really experience new things, especially travel. At this point, I've seen enough of the world, and I'd rather just skulk around my own patch from now on, which feels kind of weird to admit out loud. Holidays are stressful and tiring, new friends are too much effort, and at work, I only really like doing things that I'm naturally good at. And I think it does say something that if I'm required to respond to more than a handful of messages on my phone within the same day, I feel an overwhelming desire to smash it to pieces. But far from whinging, all that I'm saying is, I love a quiet life. The older I get, the quieter my life is, and therefore, the better. I love getting older so far. In fact, I wouldn't be 20 years old again for the world. That time in my life wasn't quiet at all. But thinking about it, in lots of ways, I've always been a grumpy old man, beyond clearly being somebody who lost any proper interest in contemporary music circa 2006. It's pathetic, frankly. I know. And by explanation, I need to make a confession that may surprise anyone who has watched a non-zero amount of the content on my humble music-related YouTube channel here. And that is, I hate gigs. Love music, hate gigs. I've been to loads of gigs, even enjoyed some of them. But as an overall experience, I'd pick going to the movies over going to a gig 99 times out of 100. For starters, festivals, back in the day, for me at least, were only ever an excuse to get loaded for several days at a time. Even now, people regularly ask me if I'm going to Glastonbury this year, and while I actually never say this out loud, I do think to myself, why would I want to spend hundreds, possibly thousands of pounds to stand in a field covered in mud, with no sleep, never having a relaxing poo, and ultimately struggling to either hear or see any of the music that I've paid to watch, when I could simply see the front row highlights for free from the comfort of my own living room. I really appreciate the visceral thrill of live music, as I will hopefully go on to explain, don't get me wrong. But are gigs really worth all the hassle? Rarely, in my experience. And nowhere drives that home more than the nightmare of a stadium gig, having to line up, getting frisked by security, everything's expensive, there's loads of people everywhere. A stadium gig is about as aesthetically pleasing as being stuck in an airport. And even if you have a good view of the Jumbotron or whatever, the sound is almost always awful. The theatre-sized gig, in all fairness, can be pretty good, and pub gigs more so. In fact, the gigs I have always consistently enjoyed the most have been the most intimate, and I suppose that is fairly logical. But I really only ever go along to big gigs these days on the rare occasion someone offers me a free VIP pass. And even then, I'm glued to the bar and out the door before the first encore. Honestly, if the Beatles somehow got back together tomorrow and we're playing down the Dog and Duck, I don't think I could stomach much more than 45 minutes of standing arms folded right next to the exit. Another part of my dislike of gigs is of course also jealousy. As like any self-respecting muso, I feel that being on the stage myself is what God put me on the earth for, rather than staring at it from a distance. And with that said, I've often told people, sincerely, that my least favourite part of playing music, at least at the lower level that I mostly did as a younger man, was the constant arseache of lugging gear across town, sound checking, constantly worrying about how many people were going to show up, and then fighting tooth and nail to get paid, if we even got paid at all. Seriously, live music is not only a young man's game, it's a mug's game. I love performing itself, but for me the ends rarely justified the means, and hats off to anyone who can make it work. It is interesting to me, however, the idea of what are historically considered the greatest gigs of all time, and which ones I might go to if I had the actual means, which is to say, if I had a time machine or whatever. I mean, for starters, it raises the question of what the greatest gig might even mean. In a sense, it can't just be as simple as a great performance on its own. Sure, maybe you're watching Queen at Live Aid thinking, this is probably one for the ages, but then some tall guy blocks your view. What if you're actually at the band's frankly overrated The Last Waltz in 1976? And just like the musicians, you've done too much cocaine and you can't really remember even being there. What if you're watching Oasis at Main Road in 96 and some Manx Scally farts in your face during Champagne Supernova? These are all very serious real-life possibilities. And even if we're just talking about the music only, maybe some legendary gigs are famous merely because they were fortunate enough to be well documented. For example, it's a bit easy to assume that The Who's live at Leeds, or Thin Lizzy's Live and Dangerous, or James Brown's Live at the Apollo were indeed outstanding gigs necessarily, because in reality, they were probably just another Tuesday night for the people involved. So with that in mind, maybe it's more those gigs that represented some kind of iconic moment or event, like the Sex Pistols playing to 42 people at Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall in 1976, famously recreated in one of my favourite ever films, 24 Hour Party People. Or maybe it was Bob Dylan going electric at Newport in 1965, or the Beatles at the Washington Coliseum the previous year. Speaking of the Beatles, I did enjoy the pleasure of watching their iconic rooftop gig at an IMAX a couple of years ago, courtesy of Peter Jackson and his world-ending AI bullshit. And that, in all fairness, was pretty special. But in all honesty, if we're talking Beatles, I think the greatest time to have ever seen them, considering they never played my favourite later era live anyway, would probably have to be during their pre-fame, anonymous, pilled-up Hamburg club days. Seriously, even John Lennon went on record to say that that was them at their best, and I really believe that. I have always harboured something of an obsession with the Beatles' Hamburg era, primarily via the 1994 film Backbeat, a great movie that has never really been recognised for how good it is. While its 90s era Dave Grohlified soundtrack is what it is, the energy of it and that of the film itself I always found to be really exciting. Partly because the young Beatles are playing primitive garage rock essentially, but also because they are jumping up and down and going nuts and frothing at the mouth the whole time, because no one really cared and they were just feeling the music back in those days. Anyone who has played in a band as a teenager will know that feeling, but there is something about being that young, dumb and full of cum that you can just often sound great as if by accident. Rock and roll is fundamentally about youth after all, and the Beatles' widely bootlegged 1962 Star Club tapes are incendiary for this reason, and I look forward to them being eventually cleaned up and re-released also, again courtesy of Peter Jackson. For those who don't know, the Star Club was the last of 4 residencies the Beatles played during their Hamburg years. All situated within a couple of blocks along the Reeperbahn. I was surprised on visiting there many years ago now how compact that area really is, and couldn't imagine how buzzy it must have been in the early 60s. Now, of course, it's a tourist trap for saddos like me. Big surprise. But the Star Club held around 2,000 people, and just about anyone who was anyone played there between 1962 and its closure in 1969, including Jimi Hendrix and Black Sabbath, before they became household names. And it was a particular favourite venue for touring American rock, blues and soul artists who might ordinarily be playing far bigger venues back home. And that's where we arrive at the subject of this video. Jerry Lee Lewis live at the Star Club, Hamburg, 1964. Far and away the single greatest live recording ever made by anyone ever. I will never be disabused of this belief. It's not the most famous live recording, far from it, but by any other metric I can think of, it simply is the best. There's no two ways about it. And frankly, the only people claiming otherwise are those who have never heard it. End of. But it's not widely known. Partly that's because it was only released in Europe at the time, and even today, the full version is still not available on Spotify. Sort it out. The fashionable thing to say about Live at the Star Club is that it's not a record, it's a crime scene. And in its own way, that does track, as Jerry Lee Lewis is of course also known as The Killer, and I have pretty good reason to believe it's a little bit more than just a nickname, as we'll get onto later. And while he does indeed slay his audience in the colloquial sense, he has the 2,000 strong crowd of steaming German drunks so thoroughly in the palm of his hand throughout this performance that rather than launch an assault on his audience, I'd say the crowd are more like lemmings willfully running over the cliffs, or lambs throwing themselves merrily to the slaughter. It's more like that wicked boogie woogie has opened up some kind of portal to hell there on the stage, and Jerry Lee Lewis and his sinful pumping piano are dragging his willing victims down into the hellfire below. And that also works because Jerry Lee Lewis was a deeply religious man who genuinely believed that the rock and roll that brought him riches, fame, and then infamy was indeed taking him straight to hell. He was afraid of his own power, and my God, can you hear it on this record. If I can surprise you, I'm not a religious man myself. And while I came of age in the edgelord atheism era of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and to a far less academic degree, Ricky Gervais, I've never been one for sneering at religious people of any religious stripe. And in fact, I view religious people no differently than I do anyone who holds a strong political ideology, for example, whatever that may be. And in all fairness, I am fairly ideological myself. So who am I to judge? I'd say the majority of religious people I've ever known have for the most part been extremely generous, thoughtful and principled. So who am I or anyone else to question that? But the other kind of religious person, perhaps one that you might ungenerously describe as a zealot, someone like Jerry Lee, who literally believes in things like a physical hell where you get roughly sodomized for eternity and the queue for the bar never gets any smaller. People like that are motivated. People who sincerely believe that they are outrunning the devil can do incredible things. Stuff like single-handedly lifting a car off somebody after an accident, or levitating, or speaking in tongues. Jerry Lee is this kind of religious man. He was not a nice man or a good man. Indeed, he made this record while effectively living in exile after the scandal of marrying his 13-year-old cousin, once removed, as we will discuss. But for all that, one thing that Jerry Lee Lewis was not was a faker. And so when he's playing that wicked boogie woogie, he is channeling what he earnestly believes to be the devil, and it sounds exactly like that. And if this is the soundtrack to hell, then I submit my whole self and nothing but myself to the devil himself. Faraday's finest, the killer, Jerry Lee Lewis, for this 37 minutes of electrifying rock and roll, capturing the pure essence of everything that is good and sinful about this art form. And if there is any validity to the idea that rock and roll is fundamentally about the expression of youth in all of its primal, confused, charged intensity, then it makes sense that it is best experienced in a live setting, both for the performer and for the audience alike. Because youth is only ever something you have for a brief time, even if you don't know it, and as soon as you do know it, it's too late. It slips through your fingers. And the beauty of early rock and roll is that there is no depth, no layers, nothing to take away and digest. What you are processing and understanding in the exact moment you hear it is everything. That's all of it. There's no subtext in an orgasm or an explosion or in Long Tall Sally. And even if there is, nobody cares. It's instantly gratifying. For as much as I embrace the album's era myself and hold up classic records as examples of creative perfection or whatever, their value is really only in their ability to capture something, to grab something intangible out of thin air in a moment and turn it into something that can be enjoyed again and again, as if for the first time, even if it was only ever an idea or a series of ideas artificially stacked on top of each other in a clinical studio setting. So what makes it all the more remarkable that live albums like Star Club can even exist is the amount of luck that goes into harnessing this kind of fire. Because unlike in a studio, you don't get to relive the moment again and again until everyone gets it right, and you aren't given the opportunity to move that microphone 1 foot to the left or turn that dial just a fraction up or down or whatever. Because it's not just a good performance or good engineering that makes a good live recording, it's the sound of the room it's recorded in as well, the number of other people in that room, and the amount of energy that is emanating from the stage to the audience and back again in the moment. And even, as if by chance, you get all of those things right, 9 out of 10 live recordings still fail to capture that lightning in a bottle. Live recordings, particularly ones recorded in venues with reflective surfaces, etc., often fail to reflect the reality of a gig because there is often so much more sound in a room beyond what is alone going into the microphones and into the sound system. And for reasons I can't really explain, something that sounds in tune in the moment is more often than not out of tune when put under the microscope of professional recording. But thankfully, there are no such problems here. All of the postmodern production in the world could not make something sound this visceral. And that is on top of the fact that few people play music like this anymore anyway, nor do they perform with pickup bands, without click tracks, without carefully choreographed light and sound, nor do they get charged up on whiskey and amphetamines and marry their 13-year-old cousins. Now that we're firmly in the age of rigid professionalism and perfectionism, the era of algorithms and AI, a glimpse of the real thing stands out like an island in a sea of mediocrity. A young Jerry Lee Lewis wouldn't last 5 minutes in the modern world, and nor would he want to. So if anyone needs a reminder as to what rock and roll is all about and what live music is capable of, you would be hard-pressed to find a better example of either than live at the Star Club, Hamburg. I remember initially downloading a FLAC version of this record when I was going through a sort of back-to-basics phase myself when I was about 24. I never went full rockabilly or anything, but I certainly was into the Brill Cream, Western shirts, and the satisfying click of a Zippo lighter. I might have even worn suspenders publicly on 1 or 2 occasions. It was a different time. This was also, of course, before you could buy obscure records with a click of a button. At least in Australia you couldn't. And even now, I don't think I've ever even seen a copy of this out in the wild. From memory, I did get my copy imported to Australia from Germany, and I remember feeling that having it on vinyl in particular brought me so much closer to this music. And to this day, years, near decades after this album lit a fire within me, and with all those affectations fallen by the wayside, I still hear now exactly what I did then. Only the single greatest live recording made by anyone ever. It's not my fault, it's true. And if you don't like it, I dare you to take it up with the killer. Jerry Lee Lewis was born in 1935 in Faraday, Louisiana. His family soon converted from Southern Baptists into an Assemblies of God Pentecostal Christian denomination. And despite the Holy Spirit's disdain for all things fun, at least wherever fun was going for impoverished Southern farmers in the mid-1930s, Jerry Lee's father Elmo could not stay off the liquor, not out of jail for long, going to prison for the second time when Jerry was aged 2 for a short stint. That same year, Jerry Lee's 9-year-old brother Elmo Jr. was run over and killed by a drunk driver. His mother Mamie was from a music-loving family, but noticed the particular gusto Jerry Lee took to singing in church as well as outside of it. On first hearing a recording of Robert Johnson, the young Jerry Lee understood from an early age the price for playing the devil's music was an eternity in hell. While his parents were determined that Jerry Lee would receive the good education they never had, he didn't take to schooling very well, preferring to play truant with his cousin Jimmy, later to become famous as the scandal-ridden televangelist Jimmy Swaggart. But it was after having discovered the piano firstly at the Assemblies of God Church and then his Uncle Lee Calhoun's house that school went entirely out the window, with the piano becoming Jerry Lee's overwhelming obsession. He immediately taught himself to play everything he heard at church, on the radio, and wafting out of the juke joints in his neighborhood. His parents were so impressed, they gambled against their own farm to borrow the money to buy Jerry Lee his very own first piano at age 10. First becoming popular as a subgenre of blues music in the late 1920s, boogie woogie was a high-energy, danceable style of piano playing that had come out of ragtime and rural African-American music, deliberately invoking the rhythm of steam trains heard across the Deep South. As well as honing in on this style, Jerry Lee also developed an early love for Jimmy Rogers, Al Johnson, and Gene Autry. Around age 12, while the family still didn't have running water in their house, they did get electricity for the first time, leading to the purchase of a radio, which turbocharged Jerry's listening and learning. This led him to the music of Hank Williams, and sneaking into local nightclub Haney's Big House led Jerry Lee and his cousins to discover a legion of black artists performing at the venue as part of the Chitlin circuit, itself enjoying something of a high point in the late 1940s. They also took to petty crime around this time, with Jerry Lee's bad boy reputation already extending to a casual disregard for women in his life, especially his younger sisters. He even pushed his sister Frankie Jean off a cliff in her stroller on one occasion. And not that the difference really mattered that much, as we will discuss later. He started getting the attention of women who were not in his family, on account of his piercing stare and mess of blonde hair. He was also a star football player, however, an on-field injury put him in a cast for 2 months and permanently affected the way he sat at the piano stool with one leg stuck out extra wide. His talent earned him the nickname The Killer in high school, which he soon stopped attending at age 14, effectively going pro as a musician, which at that point meant little more than showing up in towns across Louisiana with his piano on the back of his dad's pickup truck and passing the hat around. This did lead to radio appearances and talent shows, and he became something of a local celebrity in his hometown of Faraday. But as ever with Jerry Lee, while he felt the seductive pull of the boogie woogie and the unholy temptations that success brought him, he simultaneously feared whatever price he would ultimately have to pay in the afterlife for that very success, playing the devil's music. In an attempt to get back on the straight and narrow, on the eve of Jerry Lee's 15th birthday, he went about 400 miles west to the city of Waxahachie, Texas, to study at the Southwest Bible Institute at the urging of his mother. Barely able to resist the sinful temptations of Dallas, only 30 miles north, Jerry Lee lasted 3 months at the Bible Institute, finally getting expelled for playing the hymn My God Is Real in a boogie-woogie style during a chapel service. Back in Faraday, he married his first wife in 1952, 17-year-old Dorothy Barton, and earnestly trained to become a preacher. Their marriage crumbled after 18 months, and Jerry Lee threw himself back into the devil's music once again. He picked up gigs all over the South while still technically a minor, notably developing a taste for whoring at Miss Nellie's Cat House in Natchez, Mississippi, the city where he also met his second wife, Jane Mitchum. In classic Jerry Lee style, at the time he had not yet divorced his first wife. The birth of Jerry Lee's first child coincided with the popularization of the new rock and roll music when Elvis Presley released his groundbreaking debut single, That's All Right Mama, on Sam Phillips' Sun Records. Jerry Lee was soon inspired to travel to Memphis with his father to audition for the label and was subsequently signed by Sam Phillips in 1956 at the age of 21 as a solo artist and session pianist for other artists then recording for Sun. Around this time, he also started playing with his Memphis-based cousin, bassist J.W. Gale, whose then 12-year-old daughter Myra would shortly become Jerry Lee's third wife. His first release, Crazy Arms, a song made famous by country singer Ray Price, sold well, if not spectacularly, in the South. He first met Elvis when the King himself dropped into a Sun Records session that already included Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins, resulting in a recording known as the $1 Million Quartet. The success of Whole Lotta Shakin Goin On, a song written by Curly Williams and Roy Hall that Jerry Lee had been honing in his live gigs, suddenly shot him to worldwide success and became one of his signature tunes, helped in no small part by an explosive appearance on The Steve Allen Show in July of 1957. It had sold more than 1 million copies by the end of that summer as a result. He proved himself as more than just a flash in the pan with the release of Great Balls of Fire, a song written by Jack Hammer and Otis Blackwell, and a record that was far more refined than its predecessor. Remarkable considering everyone at the session got drunk and Jerry Lee nearly abandoned the song entirely, on deciding that it was the devil's music after all. Fortunately, Sam Phillips talked him round, and Great Balls of Fire went on to become the highest selling single in the history of Sun Records. He married his 13-year-old cousin, as you do. He appeared singing the title song in the film High School Confidential, widely considered one of the worst films ever made, and settled a long-standing rivalry with Chuck Berry by setting fire to his piano on stage in Brooklyn in response to being made to go on before Chuck. Probably an apocryphal tale, in all fairness. Which nonetheless speaks to Jerry Lee's incredible approach to stagecraft, all the more impressive that he has to stay glued to his piano. For starters, what he is doing musically is extremely complicated and only the kind of interlocking left-right coordination you can achieve by playing the piano for 1 billion hours. I mean, with a guitar, you are fretting a note with one hand and plucking it with the other. You're performing a single two-handed action at any one time, if that makes sense. With a piano, it's more like you're playing 2 instruments simultaneously, and that's before you even get to using pedals. He's basically a one-man band. His left hand almost never leaves the keyboard and provides a constant low-end melody and rhythm that effectively doubles whatever a real bass player, electric or upright, might be playing. And when he isn't pounding out triplets or lightning-fast stabby solos with his right hand on the upper register, he's singing. So there's always a focus of attention for the viewer and the listener for that matter, on top of holding it all down with the constant steam train rhythm of his left hand. And aside from insane stuff, certainly for the time, like setting fire to his instrument, something only somebody with the extreme confidence of Jimi Hendrix would even dare to attempt a whole decade later, his routine stage manner is remarkable. For one, moving his straight up from the ground mic stand back and forth, depending on how intimate he wants the vocal to be in that part of the song, gesturing wildly to the audience to emphasize the lyrics, and kicking out his own piano stool from under himself whenever the song takes off. He might be glued to the piano, but he sure as hell doesn't seem restricted by that whatsoever. And Jerry Lee had all of this, fully formed as an act in 1957, and he effectively never changed that formula. And it didn't matter that his subsequent single releases varied so much following his first major hits, because Jerry Lee Lewis, as part of the first wave of rock and roll innovators, was never really supposed to evolve, never supposed to be an artist beyond fulfilling a need to entertain. Obviously, the album's era began in the 1960s, but let's not forget it took until more than halfway through that decade for albums to become in and of themselves considered worthy statements. So it's no wonder that Jerry Lee Lewis churned out album releases mostly as vehicles for his singles, just as everyone else did in the business. On top of that, the 50s was still the era where artists were rarely expected to compose their own material, and personal appearances were their main cash cow, much as they have again become now since the streaming age has made record making a redundant form for the most part. At the peak of his early fame, he was earning thousands of dollars per show, and it seemed only natural that Jerry Lee should take his act to Europe and give England a taste of the real thing, as opposed to the weak sauce of Cliff Richard, whose first hit in the summer of 1958 gave birth to a domestic, British form of rock and roll. But what the 22-year-old Jerry Lee hadn't counted was how bloodthirsty the British press was and always has been, nor how mainstream British sensibilities might react to seeing his child bride, who also happened to be his first cousin once removed, arrive at Heathrow Airport on his arm. The ensuing controversy saw his planned 37-date concert tour cancelled after only 3 poorly received London shows. Now, I'd like to address the elephant in the room here, and in many ways the root cause of Jerry Lee's decade-long wilderness period to follow. This might risk coming off as an edgy hot take here, and I will preface this by saying that any adult in a sexual or romantic relationship with a child represents a clear-cut abuse of power and is wrong on every possible level. But I think what people forget, especially in relation to so many of our rock and roll heroes, is that this understanding we have is a relatively new one. Lots of people have pointed to, say, Brian Wilson, David Bowie, Jimmy Page, and the world's most unlikely pants man, Bill Wyman, as examples of people whose proclivities may have skewed in this direction, to put it mildly. And while I absolutely condemn some of them, Jimmy Page in particular, who is definitely going to hell, I think it's only fair to point out that this sort of thing was far from unusual in its day. The Beach Boys, for example, were all more or less children themselves when they all took child brides. It's highly surprising that these corn-fed morons, suddenly famous at an incredibly young age and specifically marketed to excitable teenage girls, might develop stunted sexual and emotional morals. While the Beatles might have had a slicker media operation back in the day, is it really that impossible to fathom that they might have skated pretty close to the edge on this kind of stuff at the very height of their fame? I don't think so. And if we can park the fact that the 22-year-old Jerry Lee Lewis's third wife was 13 years old at the time, the fact that she was also his first cousin would not have raised so much as an eyebrow in the rural Deep South in the 1950s. I'm also at pains to say that I'm against that sort of thing, but there are lots of illogical, morally questionable traditions some people have held on for just a little bit too long, and I find it difficult to be judgmental about the practices of cultures that I am not part of and that I can't even pretend to understand myself. Plus, my cousin's pretty hot, so... But the scandal that erupted in England seemed to follow Jerry Lee home, and despite his rudimentary efforts to salvage his image in the public eye, including open letters published in the paper and a comically misguided novelty record, Jerry Lee was now just a washed-up backwoods hick who married his child cousin. Elvis at least was savvy enough, or at least his handlers were savvy enough, to keep his child bride, Priscilla, herself 14 years old at the start of their relationship, out of the public eye. This is of course made easier by the fact that he had met her in West Germany, having entered the US Army in 1958, signalling, alongside the plane crash that took Buddy Holly, Richie Valens and the Big Bopper, something of a death of the first wave of rock and roll, literally and figuratively. While superficially, the Jerry Lee Lewis scandal put him in league with Chuck Berry, who was arrested also for charges related to underage sex in 1959, it was actually Little Richard, as a similarly God-fearing piano beater, with whom Jerry Lee really did share much more in common. Either way, rock and roll had been taken to the vet and had its knackers done, and Jerry Lee Lewis could scarcely get arrested over the next decade, releasing a string of poor to mid-selling singles and albums on Sun, and from 1963 on, Nashville-based Smash Records, and beset by family tragedy, including the drowning of he and Myra's son in the family swimming pool in 1962. Being the superstitious thug that he was, he of course blamed his wife's sinfulness for their son's death and took to regularly beating her for imagined indiscretions. Class act, old Jerry Lee. He returned to the UK in the immediate wake of his son's death to a far less explosive reception, but nonetheless learned that by now there was more enthusiasm for his old style of rock and roll in Europe than there indeed was back home. Which is just as well, as the arrival of the Beatles in America in 1964 sent shockwaves through the pop music industry around the world. The black pop artists of Motown and Phil Spector's stable felt this especially keenly, particularly in the States, where they had up until then stepped into the breach left by Jerry Lee's first wave cohorts, seemingly all at once in the late 50s. Continually drawn back to England, the country that had effectively killed his career, it was on his third visit in 1964, an expanded tour that also included much of the European continent, where the miracle of Live at the Star Club came into being. So the first thing to say about Star Club, which also pertains to Jerry Lee's wider career, is that the majority of these songs, in fact all but one on Star Club, are songs not written by Jerry Lee Lewis himself. And it's worth saying that while modern parlance might describe these as cover songs, I think the word cover unnecessarily implies an element of copying, or at least an air of unoriginality. The difference is marginal for most, but I must stress that as a first-generation rock and roller, choosing from a relatively standardized songbook was not unusual whatsoever. Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Carl Perkins and Elvis Presley himself were more or less doing the same tunes. Chuck Berry is probably the biggest exception to that, as idiosyncratic as he was. This is something that this generation shared in common with purveyors of the folk tradition, who instead pointedly performed arrangements, versions, or interpretations of traditional songs. This delineation I've seen pointed out in relation to the inaccurate syntax used in the Bob Dylan biopic, A Complete Unknown, and I think it's important to understanding where artists were coming from aesthetically in the pre-Beatles, pre-do-it-yourself era. I might add as well that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, etc., also did start out drawing from the same pool or pools of material in their early days. And it must have seemed perverse to the early rock and rollers to see artists emerge who not only wrote their own songs, but were also, on the face of it, equal partners within a group. So as well as the only track on Star Club written by Jerry Lee Lewis alone, Lewis Boogie, a fine piece of self-mythologizing in and of itself, we get Jerry Lee's signature hits, including the co-written title track from High School Confidential, alongside a selection of early rock and roll standards, most, if not all of which, Jerry Lee recorded and released himself, of course, but themselves in the set list primarily because they were simply songs that the audience would be familiar with that folded neatly into Jerry Lee's raucous style. This is especially the case because Jerry Lee is in pure entertainer mode here. He is touring relentlessly across the American and European club circuits, not necessarily to boost his profile and generate interest in his contemporary album releases, but instead to bring the house down night after night and walk away with a suitcase of cash every time. And of course, the songs themselves, lyrically, are not up to much, and they are all the better for it. As I say, rock and roll is by definition young people's music, so it stands to reason that it lyrically speaks to the concerns of young people, young relationships, school, cars, having a good time, and probably more than anything else, shagging. And as this was recorded in '64, someone like Jerry Lee Lewis, who was by this time comparatively ancient at the age of 28, was likely unsure of what this brave new post-Beatles world really was, and had likely resigned himself to a lifetime of playing the 50s hits of his heyday to ever-diminishing crowds. Which is, in a sense, at least for a time, exactly what happened. By this time, he had been playing Whole Lotta Shakin for a good 7 years, and it's remarkable that his performance across the board is injected with such fervour when you consider that. But why? The first thing to consider is that we are indeed hearing a man on the ropes here. His once promising career has been usurped by the nosy British press, who seem to have a big problem with the whole marrying your 13-year-old cousin thing, and it turns out polite society, even back home, feels similarly. And Jerry Lee, by all reports, knew almost nothing of the world outside of rock and roll, religion, and comic books. So he's quids in on his music career and feels he has no choice but to slowly pull himself back up the ladder, not even by making new music necessarily, but instead through endless touring, night after night, getting up there, playing the hits with whatever scratch band of callow youth he can scrabble together. And if America won't have him, he has to expand his remit to include European audiences, just as the black artists he first saw on the Cheatin circuit back at Big Haney's house in Faraday had similarly since ridden the English blues wave of fame over to small and mid-sized venues like the Star Club on the continent. And like them, he was doing it the hard way, because he was by then effectively living in exile and had nowhere else to go. And as you can hear, rather than simply phoning it in like almost anyone else in his situation might do, Jerry Lee's performance is charged with wild abandon, a religious fervour, because as far as he is concerned, that's not him up there on the Star Club stage testifying angrily to the gathered drunken throng, hectoring, compelling them to shake that thing. It's instead the raw spirit of rock and roll speaking through him, a higher power, or maybe even a lower one. Obviously, religion played a big part in Jerry Lee's life, and it's no coincidence that he more than once considered becoming a preacher himself. His fear of spending an eternity in hell for the sin of spreading the devil's music again and again, guiding the many twists and turns of his career. Now, as we know, Jerry Lee Lewis was not a particularly good man who led a particularly virtuous life, but one can only imagine how much worse a human he might have been had he not lived in constant fear of going to hell, a fear drilled into him via his religious upbringing. Good God. Little Richard is also a notable early rock and roller who took this stuff extremely seriously, to the point that he also at various points also attempted to abandon rock and roll in order to make it up to God one way or the other. While Little Richard also dabbled in Pentecostal Christianity, among other denominations in his life, he and Jerry Lee shared in common an incredible, almost supernatural talent that they both genuinely believed was actually not of them, and was instead something otherworldly that was being channeled through them, not dissimilarly to the way that the Holy Spirit might cause churchgoers to speak in tongues or whatever. On Live at the Star Club, what you are hearing is the sound of Jerry Lee getting his audience higher and higher, while his soul is being pulled further and further down towards hell. And of course, I've deduced all of this merely from a recording, which is a disservice to Jerry Lee's incredible command of the Star Club stage itself and the baying crowd. This is what you don't get on live albums recorded in the comparatively unintimate corporate environs of this stadium or stadia. The audience responds audibly to the energy of the music, and as a consummate performer of the old school, Jerry Lee knows exactly how to play the crowd, bringing them down before bringing them back up again, just like a DJ might do nowadays. I suspect Jerry Lee probably didn't even know at the time that he was being recorded here. So much is his act so thoroughly worked out. Not so much routine, but just natural to him. And while the recordings of a pre-fame Beatles at the same venue 2 years earlier had been a slapdash, lo-fi affair, Siegfried Ziggy Loch of Philips Records was already well into the habit of recording touring performers on the Star Club stage. And all credit goes to him for capturing this so well. It's fitting that Loch was an employee of Philips' jazz division, as I would ordinarily associate a live recording of this standard with jazz of the early 60s, rather than rock and roll. And maybe that's partly because early rock and roll's emphasis was not on loudness, and of course live music venues of the time had extremely primitive sound systems, if they had them at all. Therefore, the recording has plenty of air in it, in the sense that not only can you hear the audience very clearly, due to the crowd ambience apparently being captured by a single stereo microphone, presumably suspended from the Star Club ceiling, but more so that the sound of Jerry Lee's piano and his backing band, the Nashville Teens, especially their drummer, have a lot of ambient sound around them, as in you can hear the space they are playing in, the hardwood floors and walls, and the distance between the source of the sound and the microphones picking them up. And of course this would have been very primitive at the time as well. I would not presume that there was any more than a maximum of 2 condenser microphones recording the whole drum kit, for example, and then maybe 1 mic for each instrument beyond that. So maybe a max of 8 inputs if we're generous, presumably into a 4-track recorder, but who knows. On the night, it could have all gone into 4 tracks or maybe even 2. It's entirely possible that what we're hearing here is a handful of mics plugged in and recorded exactly as they were, with little or no post-production mixing involved. After all, many future legendary albums were recorded in far more primitive ways than this, and Star Club shares this raw simplicity with so much of the garage rock and proto-punk it would later inspire in this decade and beyond. The 3-track recording of the Stooges' 1973 album Raw Power springs to mind. But either way, it couldn't sound more alive. Some people think the piano is too loud, some other people think the aggression in the performances create a crashing noisiness. These detractors are in fact wrong, and fail to understand the essence of rock and roll. Rough, ready and raw as the day it was born, red in tooth and claw, hammered out mercilessly by this most feral piano pounder and his teens of Nashville. And it is worth explaining as well who the Nashville Teens were. Formed in 1962 in the town of Weybridge in Surrey, a posh English county just to the southwest of Greater London, were basically a band of jobbing musicians who had many members over the years, and with members John Allen on guitar, Pete Shannon Harris on bass, and Barry Jenkins on drums, accompanied Jerry Lee Lewis on his 1964 European tour. The Nashville Teens at the time technically had an additional 3 members, a keyboardist and bizarrely 2 standalone lead singers. They are most famous for their hit version of John D. Loudermilk's Tobacco Road, also released in 1964, having caught the attention of London-based producer Mickey Most while subsequently backing Carl Perkins and Chuck Berry on their 1964 European tours. Tobacco Road basically made them a one-hit wonder, and while they cycled through dozens of members over the years, they are somehow still working today. And in 1964, the 3 Nashville Teens backing Jerry Lee and his pumping piano do a very solid job of supporting the killer, but only just manage to keep up with his manic energy, giving the performances on Star Club an incredible forward propulsion. This is indeed similar to how the Beatles must have sounded in their early days, quite literally playing on the same stage as here. Simple music delivered with fire, perhaps not the steely professionalism that Jerry Lee's backing band back home may have delivered. And it's worth saying as well how lucky we are that the Nashville Teens were as good as they were, else this recording may never have seen the light of day. I cannot stress how the habit of touring first-wave American rock and rollers of using pickup bands when and where throughout their careers so famously produced mixed results. Chuck Berry in particular, to his dying day, famously would let any old slag play in his backing band, and there are some shockingly poor performances out there. Such was his expectation that everyone would just know all of his music back to front and understand his cues without rehearsal. Do you know what a 12-bar blues is? Yes. You're in the band. Cheers. So hats off to the Nashville Teens for meeting Jerry Lee perhaps more than halfway here, particularly drummer Barry Jenkins, who in true Ringo Starr style correctly opts for playing mostly simply and powerfully throughout rather than trying to get too clever with it. But back to the man of the hour, Jerry Lee Lewis. At the time of recording, he was 28, and while that's indeed ancient in 1964 money, people now might rightly appreciate why he was low-key in his prime at this age. His early performances are of course as electrifying as you might expect, but here his talent is so road-worn and effortless, particularly in how casually he'll drop an impossibly melodic piano riff into a solo that is otherwise just bashing the same chord as quickly as he can. Considering how visceral this recording is, I can't help but wonder what it could have done for his career stateside at the time where it released there. Perhaps it contributed to the ever-bubbling teddy boy rocker movement that always has persisted in the UK, unlike in America where 50s nostalgia took a little longer to take hold, firstly in the form of groups like Sha Na Na, and then later on, stuff like Happy Days and Grease in the 70s. But in 1964, if I'd have known that Jerry Lee was playing like an utter demon in nightclubs like this, then again, I'd sure as hell choose that experience over struggling to either see or hear the Beatles in a stadium full of shrieking teenagers around the same time. So in lieu of a time machine, let's take a closer look at what went down on the Reeperbahn on that hot April night of 1964. So the very first thing we hear at the beginning of the greatest live recording of all time is the abrupt final seconds of the Star Club MC's, presumably Horst Fascher, German language introduction. The words, "Jerry Lee Lewis," to the rapturous applause of the club crowd. Now, presuming this indeed was the first track in the actual performance, it's thrilling to imagine Jerry Lee sauntering up to his piano stool, trilling coolly through his speed-locked jaw, and quietening the crowd with an introductory broken chord as the band braces itself. And with no further pleasantries or even a count-in for the band, Jerry Lee's a cappella introduction is immediately recognised by the crowd, and only just by the Nashville teens, who launch into the first song of the set, clearly clinging on for dear life. Originally written by Claude Demetrius and released by Elvis Presley in 1957, Jerry Lee Lewis's studio recording of Mean Woman Blues later that year fairly thoroughly reworked the entire song beyond its opening lines, and was certainly the basis of Roy Orbison's version released in 1963. Whereas the original lyrics on Elvis's version focuses more on how literally mean his woman is, making black cats superstitious when they cross her path and making love without a smile. A bit weird, that one. Jerry Lee is more concerned about the sinful power her physicality has over him, and yet can't help but refer to himself in the third person. Firstly about how she makes old Jerry flip, and when Jerry does something, I do it mighty good. I suspect Jerry rarely sang the same lyrics through twice identically, as he was famously forgetful and tending to rely on busking whole verses. That said, I do think the song's final chorus, reduced from repeating the song's opening line in full down to just, "I got a woman," is a deliberate nod to the Ray Charles track of that very name released in 1957. In the first of the song's two between-verse instrumental breaks, Jerry takes the solo, establishing a precedent for most of his lead breaks on the album, replete with triplets and glissandos, or slides up the keyboard, so elemental and powerful, almost angrily simple, and that even a cack-handed, two-fisted piano player like me can almost replicate it, although only if I play one hand at a time and using two hands for each part. Barely audible John Allen of the Nashville Teens takes the second lead break in a similarly raw and unsophisticated style that would make Dave Davis proud. Just as he famously does on Great Balls of Fire, Jerry brings things down real low ahead of the song's final barnstorming chorus, playing with the audience like a cat toying with a half-dead mouse, purring and laughing to himself while casually dropping some boogie-woogie with his right hand that defies belief. He does the band a favour by signalling into the last screamed chorus, and I particularly enjoy how instead of your typical blues turnaround signalling the end of the song, he instead just hammers one note for 4 bars before abruptly stopping, the band sounding like they had no idea what he was going to do. The audience erupt in appreciation before he goes into his no doubt boilerplate introductory patter, thanking everyone for having him back at the fabulous, most beautiful, really swinging Star Club, alright? Co-written by Lewis's long-term writing partner Ron Hargrave, and of course the title track for the 1958 film of the same name, High School Confidential is both this album's perhaps preeminent and most representative example of how completely jumping out of his skin with energy Jerry Lee really is on this recording. It rocks so much harder than the original song that it scares me, frankly. Like so many Sun Records artists who kind of went on to lose a lot of their rawness over time, High School Confidential as a studio creation is a perfectly serviceable, perhaps by-the-numbers slice of 50s style rock and roll, inoffensive, almost as if created by AI. Open up, honey, it's your lover boy, me comes a knocking. Why don't you listen to me, sugar, other cats are at the high school of rockin'. But in this version, the band definitely matches Jerry Lee for each beat of the song's syncopated introduction. But after that, Jerry Lee's off to the races, and the Nashville teens are playing catch for the song's remaining 2 minutes. Honey, get your bopping shoes, for the jukebox to blow the fuse. Now everybody's hopping, everybody's bopping at the high school hop. Whoa! This time he takes several solos, clearly enjoying himself when he forgets the lyrics and substitutes nonsense words. But then not forgetting the lyrical nod to Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven with the line, "My heart's a beating rhythm and my soul keeps a singing the blues." By the time he turns into the song's final repetitive chorus, Jerry Lee's a full beat ahead of the ailing Nashville teens, and by the time the song ends, he has the audience in the palm of his hand, cheering, "Jerry, Jerry, Jerry," as he wipes his brow and immediately introduces his next little ditty. Released as a fairly limp single by Jerry Lee in 1961 and written of course by Berry Gordy and Janie Bradford for Barrett Strong in 1959, Money, brackets, That's What I Want, close brackets, is a song every man and his dog knows. Seriously, if you don't know this song already, I can't imagine why you were watching this. A signature Tamla Motown track, in fact the label's very first hit record, the song is essentially a 12-bar chord structure centered around a simple chromatic riff, with a shameless lyric celebrating the joy, or more charitably, the necessity of greed. It's been covered by everyone under the sun, and while Barrett Strong's original is sure hard to beat, the Beatles version is incredible in all fairness, and the Flying Lizards version is indeed iconic as well. But it is this very live version by Jerry Lee Lewis that is my personal favourite, and despite its relatively mid-tempo, is probably my favourite cut on Live at the Star Club. For starters, he takes the central riff, and instead of playing it chromatically, as it is done on most other versions that we're familiar with, emphasising this note, in his own slippery fingered way, he keeps it in a harmonically less ambiguous minor pentatonic key by avoiding that passing blue note altogether, like this. Additionally, a change to the bass part, which in the more familiar version shifts between the first chord or note in the song's key to the fourth, like this. Jerry Lee's version instead shifts between the first chord and the fifth chord, which gives the song a completely different feel, like this. But what I think I like most about it is how it sounds, because unlike most of the other tracks on Star Club that are otherwise fast and furious, the pacing of this version of Money really lets you hear the mid-range bite of Jerry's piano and the air around the band's rhythm section, especially when Barry Jenkins moves to keeping time on the floor tom in the a cappella vocal and drum sections of each verse. For once, we're not being pummeled with sound, allowing everything to breathe just a little bit. The fact that Jerry Lee's vocal sounds comparatively less frenzied, or even perhaps somewhat disengaged compared to the other tracks, I think only adds to the song's effortless, sexy, breezy slinkiness and the all-round fantastic sound of Jerry Lee and the Nashville Teens together as a group on that stage on that night. It's still not without its flashy moments, of course, with some obligatory piano frills, another bring it down low before we bring it back up section for an almost angry-sounding finale, including yet another variation on a bluesy turnaround. That's what I want! Yeah, yeah, yeah! Jerry Lee doesn't even attempt to cue the band to kick off Matchbox. Its rough start and comparatively lackluster performance, possibly explaining why it has not been included in every edition of this album. Like its predecessor, it's a track that the Beatles also covered, Matchbox being one they gave to Ringo to sing, which in my view is more or less on the money as far as how worthy the tune is. Nothing against Ringo or composer Carl Perkins, of course, but it's just never been a song that has got my blood pumping, to be honest, regardless of who does it. Not that the performance here lacks its own charms, most notably the relentless 4-on-the-floor bass drum pattern and the chug of the guitar, which is more audible than just about anywhere else on this recording. I do also enjoy the innuendo of lines like, "If you don't like my peaches, honey, don't shake my tree," fitting as the song has origins in the works of Ma Rainey and Blind Lemon Jefferson, early blues artists who weren't afraid of a bit of filth in their lyrics. Worth noting as well that as a fellow Sun Records artist, Jerry Lee had actually played on Carl Perkins's 1957 original and went on to release his own version 2 years later. Jerry Lee gives us his very best "Oh yeah!" roar and launches into the iconic keyboard lick from Ray Charles's legendary 1959 hit, What I'd Say. And speaking of sexual innuendo, this song was apparently enormously controversial for its lyrics, although as a text I can't see anything more offensive than "shake that thing," which to my mind gives "showing too much ankle energy." That said, the orgasmic a cappella call and response between Ray and the Rayettes in the original version does seem pretty suggestive in all fairness. Sadly, Jerry Lee skips this part in his version, which I think is a great shame, considering how clearly up for it the Star Club crowd is. Split across two sides of a single on the original and split across two tracks here on this album also, What I'd Say is really a 12-bar simple jam that in its original form really benefits from a slinky, sexy Latin-influenced drum part. Here it gets the Jerry Lee treatment, which of course means it is way faster, with a galloping 4-on-the-floor rhythm, and by the third verse he is not even trying to seduce us or will the ladies onto the dance floor. He is instead machine gunning each syllable in his own manic, half-nonsense staccato style. Within the first 2 minutes of part 1, he's just screaming his head off. And while the band for the most part keeps up with him, there's a great moment where they miss Jerry's cue on "I wanna know!" joining him on the second beat of the bar rather than the first. As he does on so many of the proper high-energy tracks on Star Club, Barry Jenkins forgoes actually playing time on the kick and snare and resorts to just smashing his kick and cymbals on every beat of the bar in order to match Jerry's manic energy. Part 2, which is effectively an extended coda, lets Jerry Lee go into his bring them down before bringing them back up routine that we've heard on 2 tracks already so far. And he brings it down so low that the band mistakenly seems to think the song has ended at one point. And even though his version lacks the horny call and response of the original, Jerry Lee is purring and panting his way through this breakdown. I also assume that the "a little bit better" is a fairly common R&B trope that calls to mind the "little bit louder now" from the Isley Brothers song Shout. Interestingly, yet another 1959 track that was spread in 2 parts over 2 sides of a single. As he brings it all to a climax, the crowd echoes his "What I'd Say" without invitation, and I think it demonstrates some of the dynamics at play here, as unlike other performers who deliberately carve out sections in their performance for crowd participation, the audience here is taking it upon themselves to join in. Jerry Lee instead delivers these songs with a cool indifference. He's performing at you, not for you. Also worth mentioning here as well that Jerry Lee released his own studio version of this song as a single in 1961. And despite the fact that the majority of his setlist is comprised of songs better known as hits by other rock and roll artists, Jerry Lee brings it all back home and makes it all about him with his signature hit, Great Balls of Fire. In fact, the crowd cheering his name in unison is the first thing we hear as side 2 opens. What strikes me about this rendition is not that it's markedly different from his studio version necessarily. After all, it's a song he must have performed thousands of times by this point, and one that audiences certainly expected to hear. It's more that the sound of the instruments and the sound of the band playing together once again is just so good that to my mind it surpasses the original and any other version of this song that I've ever heard. And it highlights how slight it is as a song in its way. 3 verses, swift verses, an instrumental break, and it's all over in under 2 minutes. And while a lot of ink has been spilled regarding instrumental minimalism as it relates to guitar players, Neil Young's signature single-note solos spring to mind, Jerry Lee certainly got the memo way earlier, as the second half of his solo here is a single chord pounded out over 12 bars, like this. And regardless of whether the track list on this record truly reflects the set list running order or not, Great Balls of Fire signals to us as listeners that side 2 represents Jerry Lee and the Nashville Teens on the home stretch, and it's going to be more or less back-to-back high-energy bangers from here on out, with one notable exception. That's certainly the feeling you get as he launches straight into Good Golly Miss Molly. The fact that it is in the key of D, a full tone higher than Great Balls of Fire in C, makes it feel like an elevation, an escalation. Good golly Miss Molly, baby it's all not to ball. And it is. It is technically slower than its predecessor, but Barry Jenkins' relentless 4 on the floor playing and the snare rolls he plays in the verses under the otherwise a cappella vocals are animalistic and propulsive. John Allen turns in what is, in my opinion, the best guitar solo of the set here, again proving, as everything on this record does, that less is indeed more, with its garage rock minimalism that would not sound out of place on a Nuggets track. Written by John Mariscalco and Robert Blackwell, the song was made famous, of course, by Jerry Lee's nearest piano-pumping maniac nemesis, Little Richard, in 1956. While Jerry Lee could never match Little Richard's vocal, I mean, literally nobody could do that. Little Richard was not known for bringing anywhere near the kind of energy to his live performances as Jerry Lee routinely did. Jerry Lee's studio version of this track came out in 1962. Also, I'd like to point out, as I have done before, how amusing I find bawling as a euphemism for having sex, particularly as the entire basis of this song's lyric rests on Miss Molly's apparent fondness for bawling. Another track we are invited to sit back and enjoy the sound of this wonderful band is Louis Boogie, the only song on Star Club written by Jerry Lee Lewis alone, and perhaps a reminder that he comes from the era of mostly live performers who effectively hadn't yet discovered the financial advantages of writing their own material. It is of course no worse for it, as it is a perfectly enjoyable 12-bar by the numbers bit of boogie, but more importantly leaning into a bit of the self-referential, self-mythologizing tendency first heard in blues music, then in rock and roll, Bo Diddley being a prominent example of that, and then later on of course a mainstay of rap and hip-hop, etc.
My name is Jerry Lee Lewis, I come from Louisiana. Play that little boogie on this piano.
Enjoy the way the tempo slows down very slightly in those a cappella parts before the band strikes up again. As well as utilising his ubiquitous triplet stabs in the solo, he also shows off some incredible piano chops here. Further in the lyric, he offers a potted autobiography, tracking his origins in Louisiana, swinging by New Orleans, and then Memphis, including a name check for That Presley Boy. Written in 1956, his studio version of this song was originally released as a single in 1958. Then doing the classic entertainer bit of finishing his spoken introduction with the first line and title of the song, the by then country standard Your Cheatin' Heart, much like Matchbox earlier in the set, provides another slight lull in the performance with its breezy country and western flavour. I would say, however, it is far superior to Matchbox, not just as a song, but particularly as Jerry Lee is clearly deferential to it and its original composer Hank Williams, one of his earliest and greatest inspirations. And while the influence of country and western runs through all early rock and roll, it's by far the most stylistically out of kilter cut on Star Club, and perhaps points ahead to Jerry Lee's successful country period that would later on run from the late 60s into the late 70s. The style clearly runs through his veins, something you hear most clearly in the classic country style riffs that he inserts between each line of the song. I find this song really charming, as he's clearly in his comfort zone on this one. Being Jerry Lee, he cannot help but do a comical number of slides up his keyboard throughout the song, however. Written by Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, and Big Mama Thornton's only hit record following its original release in 1953, Elvis Presley's famous rendition of Hound Dog came out in 1956, and more than this being Jerry Lee trying to show that Memphis upstart how it's really done, I suspect that this stage of the set is actually switched purely into Mac Shaw mode, and he is just trying to get the audience as worked up as possible for the big finale. As well, at this stage of the set, he and the band are just bashing the songs out. Not only are they pumping full steam on the primitive 4-on-the-floor beat, even Jerry Lee's piano part at its core reduced to a simple swung eighth groove that even I can play.
There ain't nothing but a hound dog.
Like so many songs on Star Club, it's basically standard at this point, and as ever, Jerry just rocks it as hard as he possibly can. I particularly enjoy how he is so possessed by it that he abandons the lyric and effectively takes to shouting instructions to the band ahead of the guitar solo.
Now we never caught a rabbit. Now I want to hear some of that guitar, boy. Play that thing. Get it, boy, yeah!
Jerry Lee somehow takes things up a notch yet further still, as his throttled voice angrily launches into the opening lines of the immortal Long Tall Sally. The band shortly joins him in the song, seemingly at a faster clip than ever before, and you can really imagine Jerry's flop of blonde curls flapping violently on his dome while he spits out the single note staccato of the song's verses.
Well, Long Tall Sally, she's pretty sweet, she's got everything Jerry Lee does need now, baby.
Even later, he more or less abandons words altogether and goes into like a kind of thing. He does, of course, insert his own name into the lyric there too, and even if he more or less mangles the order of the verses compared to the original, nobody in that room, least of all Jerry Lee, is at the point of caring. In another masterclass in minimalism, the first solo he takes is almost literally 12 bars of the same note. He lets John Allen take the second solo before the final verse and the song's famous barnstorming outro. The band even misses the final accent as Jerry Lee winds it up simply with a wap-bam-a-loom-bap-a-lop-bam-boom in a nod to the song's originator. It was originally released as a single by Little Richard in 1956 and was co-written by him alongside Robert Bumps Blackwell and Anotrice Johnson. It's pretty obvious why everyone ever has done a cover of this song, and a good reason why the Beatles always played it as the last number in their sets at the height of Beatlemania. I love the heavy thud of the Beatles' live version of it, of course, but there is something about Jerry Lee Lewis's take that is like a train coming off the tracks. Almost like it was a victory lap, Jerry Lee settles into the comparative smooth breeziness of his crowd-pleasing signature hit, Whole Lotta Shakin Goin On. And in a way, he closes the show not on the highest high of his set, performance-wise at least, but almost as if he doesn't want to leave the crowd too worked up when he walks off for fear of what carnage he might have unleashed. He goes through his usual routine of taking the band down real low and laying out his instructions for shaking it, as it were, almost word for word the same way he did on his breakthrough Steve Allen Show performance of this song nearly 7 years earlier. But being the consummate showman that he is, he kicks off the song's fiery outro with "Let's Go One Time!" Barry Jenkins gives a sharp crack on the snare, and Jerry Lee no longer singing at all. He is screaming at us to "Shake, baby, shake!" He takes us round the block 3 times before closing it out with an outro almost identical to the one in Mean Woman Blues that opened the set. And it's hard to believe this really was the set closer as the recording fades out again to the crowd's "Jerry, Jerry, Jerry" intonation. Jerry Lee's career purgatory continued for another half-decade following the release of Live at the Star Club. For contractual reasons, the record was only released in the European market and not in the United States until several decades later. Which is a shame, because I could easily imagine a record as powerful as this one making a serious dent in the American market. Then again, maybe not. What do I know? Jerry Lee, however, mirroring the comeback of his primary rival, Elvis Presley, that same year, had a career resurgence in 1968 when he almost accidentally had his first hit on the country charts. Scoring 17 top 10 country singles up until 1977, remarkably, Jerry Lee Lewis was for several years one of the most successful country music stars in the world, although he never really got a grip on his business affairs or his continually dramatic personal life. Over this time, his increasing reliance on whiskey, pills and cigars saw him age rapidly beyond his years, easily appearing a decade older than he really was by his mid-30s. Myra, the young bride whose marriage to Jerry Lee had so disrupted his promising early career, left Jerry Lee in 1970, after which he survived a succession of stormy marriages right up until he married his 7th and final wife in 2012. And I say survived because sadly, more than one of his wives did not survive being married to Jerry Lee Lewis, dying in mysterious circumstances. I'm not saying I know anything, and there is no conclusive proof of any foul play that I'm aware of. All I will say is, they didn't call him the killer for nothing. And that's not the half of it. When he wasn't busy not murdering his wife, he was having his property seized by the IRS, being arrested for public intoxication, including a memorable incident where he attempted to drive his Lincoln Continental through the gates of Elvis's Graceland estate, and waving guns at people, including his bass player, who he actually shot in the chest accidentally in 1976. To be fair to Jerry Lee, bass players can be pretty annoying. And even if the hits gradually dried up, he firmly entered elder statesman territory in the 80s, firstly through his induction to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, and then a blockbuster biopic, or biopic, depending how you say that word, Great Balls of Fire, based on his life, released in 1989, starring Dennis Quaid as Jerry Lee. He continued recording and performing live right up until 2019, when a stroke caused paralysis in his right hand, and he passed away at the age of 87 in 2022. A solid innings if there ever was one. Now, in sharp contrast to most of the artists I have talked about on this channel, I have no problem admitting that I have heard very little to almost none of his recorded output outside of Live at the Star Club and the studio renditions of his biggest hits. And that's not because his wider output was less worthy by any means. I mean, of course that's possible, I simply don't know. In a sense, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant because live music at its very best is transient by nature. And when it is recorded appropriately and the mics are plugged in and the tape is rolling, etc., it's solely up to the performer at that point to rise to the occasion or not. There are no second takes and no overdubs. What we are hearing, while still only a two-dimensional reproduction of reality as it really occurred on that hot spring evening of 1964, is what the individuals present were hearing for the most part in real time. And there are no second takes in life either, as it happens. And if I am wrong and Jerry Lee is right, which may well be the case for all I can confidently declare, then there is indeed a hell below us, and this hell-raising, cousin-fucking, wife-murdering redneck is there right now, pounding his piano to splinters for the gathered throng of sinners. And it's because of this deeply flawed and therefore deeply human individual's willingness, in a sense, to surrender his soul at the altar of rock and roll that we even have the chance to experience what being alive really is. Because that's what Live at the Star Club is. More than just recapturing the rush of youth as we might remember it through the old songs, but instead, through the sheer power of music alone, making your hair stand on end, putting a shiver down your spine, or making your tender regions twitch back into life. This is what it means to be alive. I am, if I'm lucky, roughly halfway through my life. And many of you, in fact, almost all of you, according to my YouTube analytics, are enjoying your autumn years as we speak. And like anyone, I have regrets, sure. But I'm pleased to say that while I might have flirted with it, I have never for the most part lived a life of sin. Certainly not like Jerry Lee did. Nor, however, have I made a piece of art that will likely be remembered long after I die, let alone anything that will be held up as an example of the very best or greatest of something. Few people have. So what? And rather than turn that feeling inward in a solipsistic, navel-gazing fashion, as the world constantly wills us to do, I instead feel grateful that I live in a world where I get to enjoy this stuff, the hard labor of more talented, more driven people. Because I am not up against the ropes in life like he was. My life doesn't depend on the success of this video or anything else, really. I'm a lucky person, and by virtue of the fact that you are watching or listening to this as well, you're lucky too. And while it could all disappear tomorrow, for now we have all of this rich culture to enjoy and should feel privileged to even consider a question such as, what is the greatest live recording ever made? Well, you can rest easy, because I've got that one covered.